So I'm really glad to have you here, and I'm looking forward to the main thing I want to talk to you about is really homelessness. It's been a subject that, for whatever reason, I've gotten really interested in myself, and this is something that I know you've been thinking and talking about a lot. So I thought, who better to talk to about this? And I know that we may have some disagreements, some agreements, and honestly, I don't have my mind made up, and that's why I think it'd be great to have this conversation with you. And I
Sure.
think where I would love to start with you is, I guess, where first of all is it's like where I was thinking about the word homelessness in the first place, and I'm just wondering, what do you think about that term in the first place? Do you really think it's the right term to even address the multitude of issues that we're seeing when it comes to what people do refer to as homelessness? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's a great way to start. It's always good to start with some definition of terms. The word itself has benign origins. I certainly saw, the use of it going back 100 years in the United States. But I do not think it's a good word to use. In fact, I think it is a propaganda word, or is used as a propaganda word, and it ends up tricking the brain into thinking that folks who are on the street, intense, often suffering visible signs of mental illness or drug addiction, that their main problem is an economic one. They can't afford the rent. The reason that's misleading is that those folks all had homes and they lost them, often because of addiction or untreated mental illness. They had families. They often lost their ties to their families, and they often stopped working and lost their jobs because of those untreated psychiatric disorders or illnesses. And we could talk about the difference between that and what we mean. So no, I think it's a poor use of the word. I think there's a separate issue of we need more housing that middle-class people can afford. Middle class and working class people can afford. We need that in most major metropolitan areas. Certainly on the West Coast, we definitely do. But we just
Yeah.
need more for millennials that are raising kids, and Gen Z, when they go raise kids. That's a separate issue from how do you deal with people whose addiction or other mental illnesses have led them to a set of behaviors where they end up on the street. Even the proverbial mother escaping an abusive husband with her two kids who's homeless, even she is much easier to take care of and is getting the care that she needs for the most part from cities. The bigger problem are the folks who are suffering from late stage addiction or untreated mental illness. And that means that we're really fundamentally dealing with that problem, which is ultimately, I believe, a problem of handling a specific set of psychiatric or mental illnesses.
Yeah, because I do find that a lot of times people are unfamiliar with the causes for the issue. So they'll see a lot of people living on the streets. Where I live, that is a pretty significant issue. And we'll use that term, and they do feel like they're under that impression that it's because they don't have housing. Whereas I think,
Right.
like you said, the issues are generally not that, because I know, at least in the case of my government, housing is very much provided. It's just that often the people choose not to take advantage of it, or they sort of destroy the housing that is provided for them. So there's and the issues that you mentioned, the drug addiction, mental health, really seemed, for the most part, are the dominant issues. I have not noticed really many exceptions to that. And like you said, there is a significant issue with housing and affordability, but that is a separate issue from that. So I think it's important to separate it, or we can't
Yeah.
really address that.
And where,
But
Catherine, where do you
yeah,
where are you?
I'm in Vancouver, so it's
Okay.
one of those meccas for
Yeah.
I think, where we see a lot of all of these issues. The same way that we see that in San Francisco, the way we see that in LA and some other major cities. And I've noticed that for you, this is an issue that you seem to really care about in particular. And so I was wondering, what is it about, what we will refer to it as homelessness in the absence of, I think, of a better term for the sake of this conversation. But what is it about this particular issue that has resonated so much with you?
Great question. So this was not an issue that I had done much work on at all before 2019. I should say that my parents were psychologists. My aunt had schizophrenia, and I experienced her psychosis, not a significant amount, but certainly on the times that we interact with her, we experienced her psychosis, and my parents had to explain that to me. So mental illness was something that we talked a lot about, and we knew a lot about growing up. I have 3 friends from high school that became homeless addicts. They became addicts and then they became homeless. 2 are dead, sadly, and one of them is still struggling, and they didn't get the care they needed. It's I'm also very much I'm a trained anthropologist. I've worked most of my life as a journalist or in an activist and an author, but I'm somebody that talks to people a lot. I'm very extroverted, and I like talking to people that I like talking to strangers, and I like talking to people on the street. I've always interacted
Didn't
with
they
folks.
warn you not to do that?
With that,
Didn't they warn you not to do that, talking to strangers?
my parents.
Yeah, like
That's a good
they
question.
warn the
It's
kids.
funny. I don't think that they ever did. I think I mean, you hear it, in the culture, but it's funny. It wasn't from my parents. And I'm a Gen Xer, and so I was born in 1971, and my parents divorced when I was 7, and so I was a latchkey kid, and we were definitely that generation that was just on our bikes everywhere throughout the city. I wouldn't say we were fearless, but we were just much more free range than kids now. And so I've always known that the folks on the street were suffering addiction and mental illness. It was never shocking to me. When I was 15 or 14, I think I came to San Francisco with my parents, and we saw it in San Francisco. I live in Berkeley now. And of course, the book is called San Francisco, but it all sort of came to a head when, my book Apocalypse Never on the environment came out in 2020. It was the culmination of really 20 years of research and writing and advocacy, and I was ready for something different. The book was a bestseller. That gave me a shot to write about something else. And it was just, for me, it was a no-brainer that it was going to be this, because it's such a big issue in the Bay Area, just like it is in Vancouver. It's an issue of national concern. And it was also something I had to do a book on because I didn't have standing in the space. In fact, my editor at Forbes said, when I tried to write, I wrote a piece on homelessness, and then I wrote another one, and I was an energy columnist, and he was like, you're not in your swim lane. That was the language they used. And then I wrote a third piece, and they just took it down. It describes a little bit how disagreeable I am. And also, then I was like, well, then if I'm going to be able to write on this, I'm going to have to write a whole book, because otherwise it's just kind of a one-off thing. And so that was when I decided to do San Francisco, and I had the pandemic, which ruined all my plans for a year, or whatever, everybody's plans for a year or two. And then that was the shot to do San Francisco.
Well, you're not afraid of being disagreeable, which is a characteristic not everyone has. Were you always that way?
That's such an interesting question. It's funny you zeroed in on that. It's something that I've only started talking about and bringing any awareness to in the last few years. I'm not it's ironic, or maybe it's not ironic. I left psychology a little bit to my folks, because it was like, that was sort of around a lot. I wanted to do something more society oriented. I was also very political. So I never learned the big 5 personality, which of course includes openness, extroversion, introversion, agreeableness, disagreeableness. But when I understood it, it was a little bit like, oh, that's me. Like, that explains a lot, and then it was also like, well, and also I'm also entrepreneurial. I keep starting organizations. I've also lost some friends over my changing views. And so it was nice. I actually wish I had identified as that earlier, because I mean, not that I'm against suffering, but I've also struggled or suffered a little bit because when you're disagreeable, people are giving you really negative feedback. What happens, you get a lot of negative feedback your whole life. You're also getting positive feedback, especially if you're achieving things. But the negative feedback, I think I would have dealt with it a little bit better if I had known that there's some things in yourself that you're not going to be able to change. I don't think being disagreeable means that you need to be in conflict with like everybody that you interact with. Like, that's crazy. I always point out, I don't argue with Jehovah's Witnesses. I don't argue with people for whom nothing's at stake. In my view, I don't think their souls are at stake, but I do think I do argue about homelessness and energy because I think really big things are at stake. And yeah, definitely, you can see the disagreeableness in there. In fact, it's really my view of, I only write about things where I'm in disagreement with the majority. As soon as the society or the culture or the policy agenda is something that I basically agree with or like, then I'm silent, because I don't see any point in, like, if, I mean, I see other people do it and I kind of go, that's fine for you. But for me, it's kind of like, if everybody's already with me on something, I'm not going to say much about it. And I think one of the consequences is that people might interpret me having a set of views I may not have just by fact of what I do and don't write about.
Right. And I see a lot of people sort of get blamed for that because they're like, well, you always just pick the
Yes,
disagreeable aspects. Well, it's just because uh, other people are already doing that. So that's not underrepresented. So you pick the
exactly.
things that other people aren't talking about. Yeah. It's interesting because I would say that I'm probably on the agreeable side of things, but then I am talking about things that are disagreeable nowadays, and so it's kind of a weird combination in
You
some
can't be
aspects.
super
So
high on agreeableness, because when we started the conversation, you said we may not agree on everything, and that's
that's
often
right.
something that might be also. It's a funny way to do it though, because it also shows that you're maybe a little uncomfortable with it. That you want to say something about it still, but I suspect you're a little bit disagreeable, or you might be a little bit above average in disagreeableness.
Maybe I'm not realizing there's maybe things that I'm like discovering about myself that I just wasn't even aware. Like I've realized I'm very competitive, for example, and I wasn't even aware of that, whereas other people were more aware of that about me than I
In
was.
you.
So in me, yeah.
Yeah.
So I was, my type A personality friend who I was shocked saw me that way.
Mm.
I thought especially compared to her, I thought she'd see me as something completely different. To her, that was no surprise. So maybe sometimes you don't know yourself. Sometimes you change, but sometimes when you face certain things, like sometimes you don't know what you are until you face it, and you don't know what you're capable of until you face it. So sometimes we just haven't been tested in the right circumstances to really know who we are, where we stand. Um, but do you feel like, because you ran for governor, like is of California, like was that for you? Was that part of, because you were sort of seeing these issues and you felt like you really wanted to make a change? And did you feel like you had a realistic shot of winning? I mean, you had a campaign that, like, I think that's around when I became aware of you, was actually because of the campaign, and we have some mutual friends, but you had a lot of sort of publicity from that. But of course, in terms of votes, you did finish ninth compared to, as much as people complain about the person who did win, he had 2.3 million votes to his name. So some people must support his policies to an extent.
Yeah.
At the same time, you got to talk about all these issues. So for you, did you realistically feel like you had a shot of winning, or did you run with the idea of like, this is an opportunity to raise awareness for some of these things and get talking about them?
Yeah, I definitely. I actually ran twice, and in 2018 I came in ninth, but last year I came in third in the primary, and so I didn't qualify for the
Messed
runoff.
up on that.
No, no, it's fine. But we did do better in 2022 than in 2018. Definitely felt like we had a really good shot last year. Obviously, very disappointed that we didn't make it to the runoff. I think it was about the main problem is we got in super late and we weren't able to raise the sufficient money. And by the time the campaign was really taken off, like when I got on Bill Maher, 3 days later was the vote. So we just got in a little bit late. I had thought that somebody else was going to run who I had endorsed in the recall election the year before. It's
Mm.
not important for the viewers to all understand this, but there was a recall election the year before in 2021, and I had endorsed somebody. I thought that person was going to run again in 2022. They didn't, so I got in at the last minute, but we're actually really happy with how it went, and it was it was an incredibly positive experience, which is not something that everybody that runs for office says. I think part of it was I never had to the part where like the fundraising was difficult. Like there's usually like a period in the campaign where it's a real slog and you're not really sure how it's going. So the advantage of it being short was that we didn't have to have that, but the disadvantage was we didn't have enough time to raise the money. And then the other issue was just that we ran as an independent, and the problem was that we wanted to pull and did pull votes from both sides, but not enough to beat the Republican candidate. So, but I'm sorry. What was the question that I'm supposed to be
Well, I
answering here?
think, but I guess ultimately you did have because you ran. So, I mean, I miscalculated a little bit in my question because you it seemed like you actually did have a shot of winning, but in the
Second
process,
time for sure.
yeah, it did seem like you also raised a lot of awareness for these issues because you went on like
Yes.
Bill Maher and some of these other shows. Like, was that also part of your strategy? Is beyond just winning, it was to raise sort of awareness?
I mean, I personally, if I wouldn't have run if I felt like running wouldn't have been good in itself. Even if I lost, that it would have been something that I would not have regretted, and that was definitely the case. I definitely wanted to win. I still think I should be governor, which I can still remember why that might seem ridiculous, but I do feel that way, and am disappointed, and still a serious major critic of the current governor. Although I've had to focus on other issues recently, we're coming back to a whole set of new criticisms of the state. So no, I mean, it's something I still, and we will definitely consider running again. Just transparently, my wife and I will make a decision probably in December, somewhere at the end of 2024, so that if we do run again, we would take the time that you need to have a proper campaign, and we'll just make decisions according to whatever all sorts of other factors that are going on. But no, absolutely. I mean, I think concretely, I think it played a role in the governor saving our last nuclear plant, and I also think it's lit a fire under the politicians to knowing they need to really start shutting down the open drug scenes that we euphemistically refer to as homeless encampments. I also think the book helped. I mean, the book came out, like 4 months before I ran, so there was a bunch of. I mean, you're here, so you must see it in Vancouver, and obviously Vancouver had a pretty important election recently, bringing in a more moderate city council, and that basic move more towards a moderate view of these issues of what we call homelessness, we've seen now up and down the left coast.
Yeah, and I love talking to drivers and regular, like you, I do love talking to strangers, actually, even
Yeah.
though I grew up like being very shy, terrified of talking to strangers, but I do love talking. And what I'm hearing just from the average person is they're much more aligned with, say, the policies that you might have to suggest. But for some reason, those are not the people that get elected. And it does seem like money is, as at least, certainly factors in quite a bit, which is unfortunate, because if you're talking about pure democracy, like, money really shouldn't be the key player in something like that, and unfortunately it is. But kind of going, I was looking at your website, and it says that since 2010, yes, I had it right the first time. 2010, homelessness has increased by 31% in California, while decreasing by 18% in the rest of the US. So I'm curious, like, why are we seeing an increase in what we're calling homelessness in certain areas, and then we're seeing a decrease in other areas, which is interesting that we're seeing a decrease, which maybe is because everyone's moving to these California, San Francisco. And is it a problem that can be solved? So yeah, I'd love to hear your
Yeah.
thoughts on that.
Yeah, and even more updated numbers, and I haven't updated them on the website yet, but we did in an article, which is as California saw a 23% increase in homelessness between 2007 and 2022, and Florida saw a 43% decline, which is amazing during that same period. And so one of the issues we all think is true, everybody that looks at this thinks is true, is that warm weather means you have more homeless people on the street. And it's just because in Boston, Chicago, New York, you can, but it's harder to sleep on the street and survive. So more people go inside during the winter in those cities. So some of it has to do with warm weather, but obviously Florida has gotten people inside. There's definitely a significant number of people that have come from around the United States to California for a variety of reasons. Some of the reasons have to do with housing policy, meaning just giving away apartments with much fewer conditions than in other cities. Also, people come for the drugs, the open air drug markets, the open air drug scene. Open air drug markets are famously their own way of advertising, and they have reputations among addicts. So if you read Tracy Helton Mitchell's memoir, for example, a very famous and very good addict memoir, she's in, oh gosh, she's in the Midwest somewhere. I want to say Ohio, but I'm not totally sure. I can't remember, but she was sort of like, I can go to Manhattan or I can go to San Francisco to maintain my heroin habit, so that's sort of known. And we interview people on the street and they'll be like from Texas or Kentucky or all over the country. I mean, there's a lot of debate about what percentage of the people on the street are from different parts of the country, because people on the street don't always tell the truth about it, because they know that there's potentially consequences to being perceived as an outsider, and someone taking advantage of the local services. But people are increasingly honest about it. But somewhere, I would say, spitballing, I would say between 50 and 75% of the people that are on the streets, not counting the people in the shelters or in homeless housing, are from out of town. So definitely some percentage of people coming from outside the United States, outside of California. And I will say, just to complicate it further, the response from a lot of conservatives is, well, if you just had stricter policies against illegal camping, illegal drug use, then you wouldn't have them. At the same time, we are taking more people from other parts of the country who are often people that are very sick or traumatized. One of the things that's often said in justification of the policies that I think have been really terrible is that the folks on the street are traumatized, and they are traumatized, but that's not a reason to not get them the help they need. And we can get into it, but yeah, basically, I would say it's policies that basically allow open air drug use, illegal public camping, and much more significant benefits. I mean, San Francisco will give you $700 in cash welfare and potentially another $150 in food stamps. And you can just live on the street and use that money for your drug habit or food or whatever. And you actually don't even have to buy food, because there's so many charities that will feed you. So if you're going to be homeless, as one of the many people in my videos that I've recorded will say, San Francisco is a really good place to do it.
Well, I was wondering, like, if you change the policies so they're less, say, accommodating of people coming in to do drugs, okay, so you'll probably decrease the number of people in, say, California or San Francisco who come there. Would you not then increase the numbers in other regions?
Yeah, I mean, you could, you wouldn't have to. I mean, my basic view is that you can't allow illegal public camping at a just basic moral level. We know you're 3 times more likely to die if you're living on the street than if you're in a shelter. And those deaths are from the things you might imagine. Homicides, drug overdose deaths, car accidents, I believe, are the top 3. You can overdose in a shelter, you can be killed, but you can't be run over by a car. So just living outside is more dangerous. And it's also, the overdoses and the homicides are much lower in the shelter. So you got to get people inside. And then people need to be evaluated for, what do they need? Some people need mandated drug treatment, mandated psychiatric care. I only support mandating those things when there's good cause, like they're breaking the law and they refuse to go inside, or they refuse to get off the streets. And even then, you got to be careful about it. But nonetheless, there's a lot of people in their late stage of addiction who need that. But my view is that this is a totally solvable problem. It's not nearly as difficult as people make it sound. But you do have to decide that you're not going to let people sleep inside. You're also not going to make the perfect the enemy of the good. That means a lot of people actually are going to be in congregate shelter where they have to share a common area with other people. And we know from some good research out of Birmingham, Alabama, that making housing contingent upon recovery from getting off drugs is a way, it creates a positive incentive for people to overcome their addiction. In other words, if you pass a urine test, you can get your own apartment unit. If you fail the urine test, you lose the apartment unit, but you don't go on the street, you just go back to congregate housing. That's known as contingency management, and it actually turns out to be something that my opponents and I both agree is really important. But the basic picture here is you're dealing with some of the most troubled, the most traumatized, the most ill people in our society. And the reason they're so difficult often is because their addiction or mental illness or both are actively telling themselves that they're fine and that they don't want to change. And so the self-destruction is actually has a kind of ideology behind it. And so it just involves tough love. It just involves being like, no, you can't sleep on that sidewalk and you can't do these things. And if you do them again, we're going to actually have to arrest you and mandate some form of care, because you're not only hurting yourself, you're also hurting the rest of society.
That's interesting. Some of the approaches you just suggested actually address a little bit of my pushback that I had in my head. So those are things that I haven't considered. So not having the options and to sort of go back to the streets, but sort of having the reward of having the private housing versus the shared housing. It's quite interesting, because also one of the issues that you have when you do have the private housing, because that has been something that people were receiving, is that A, they destroy it, and B, because they're alone, they're more likely to overdose and not get help. So one of the reasons why people were sort of advocating that it's okay for them to be on the streets and living more communally was that they weren't then overdosing and dying. So that sort of does kind of take care of that concern. And as far as, I guess, you saying that this is solvable, I mean, I don't know if it's like 100% solvable. I think it can be improved. And I would say the evidence for that is we're seeing that things are getting worse. And if things are getting worse, that means that there are policies that are contributing to things getting worse. That means they can get better if we improve the policies.
Yes.
Which is it's kind of funny in a way, that things getting worse is kind of an optimistic thing in a way.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think, and by the way, Alberta is pioneering a more European approach to this right now, ironically, because Alberta is a more conservative province than British Columbia, but it is pursuing an approach more in line with what I documented them doing in Netherlands and Portugal, which is that they're building 11 $25 million recovery communities that are in the countryside. And one thing that they're doing that's so important is, so first of all, and people get medically assisted treatment too. So Suboxone is the kind of state of the art heroin replacement therapy, or all opioid replacement therapy. They even have something called Sublocade now, which is a 30-day Suboxone regimen, so you don't have to take it every day. We also have a 30-day antipsychotic meds, which are very important for people suffering schizophrenia or severe bipolar, or other psychiatric disorders. And those things are really good because they stabilize people and allow them to get care. And they are planning in Alberta that some people are going to need to be in recovery for like a year or more, because the old 30 days of rehab and you're out, we know just hardly works with anybody. I mean, 90 days has been kind of standard for a while, but even with people that are addicted to these drugs now are so potent and so addictive and so intoxicating and so deadly, particularly methamphetamine and fentanyl, that they really do require longer periods of care. And even then, everybody expects, high rates of relapse, after people are going through this regimen. But basically, it's kind of what it is. What it is. It's rehab. We all kind of know what it is. We see it in the movies, or you have friends or family that go through it. It's often just a brutal struggle, and then people Some of them, we know a lot of people age out of it. A lot of people, some people can recover on their own. Most people don't become addicted even after experimenting. The good news is, and it is worth pausing on it, most people don't experiment with the really dangerous drugs. The people that do mostly don't get addicted. Most of the people that do get some kind of a dependency are able to quit. So the people that we see who are just destroying themselves in public are the most difficult folks, kind of by definition. So, it is amazing. You kind of go in San Francisco, 20,000 homeless people come through the city every year. There's about 7,700 right now at any given time. LA is insane. LA is more like 60,000. But nonetheless, that's not, 600,000. It's not 6 million. This is a population with complicated and difficult psychiatric disorders, sometimes tied to personality disorders like antisocial disorder that can make people very difficult to deal with. But it's not something that we don't have a lot of experience dealing with. And, honestly, my view is always, I looked around the world, and Japan does this differently than the Netherlands. Netherlands does it slightly differently than Portugal, but they all are using carrots and sticks, rewards and consequences for getting people into care. And the picture that had been presented, particularly by the left, had been that, that it's really a choice between medical care and a medical approach and criminal justice. And the fact of the matter is that many people are going to need some combination of those two. And in fact, in the Netherlands, the character in San Francisco, the real life character, is a nurse who describes this. He says, the police become a little bit more like social workers. The social workers become a little bit more like police. But this thing that I'm criticizing in my work is this effort to kind of purify the category of the social worker so there's no coercion involved whatsoever, and then keeping the police out of it. And that's a terrible approach and doesn't work and leads to the kind of disasters that we've seen on the West Coast.
So this is where I think I get a little bit antsy, I suppose, or conflicted. So I know you do advocate for mandatory addiction and psych services, at least in some cases, right? As you said, more in the cases where maybe somebody had committed a crime, so violated something, whether they're illegally maybe camping out on the streets or committing worse crime. I guess we can kind of figure out where to draw the line. But and I do think it's true that many people on the streets require such services. But to me, it poses two kind of serious questions. So one is more of a moral question. And it is more about depriving people of choice and whether the state has the right, to do that, and whether we can trust the state also to do that, especially given that it does have sort of a checkered history in that regard, and has been quite abusive, and trust is a serious issue, and I think trust in many institutions is at a low, and in many cases quite justified. Again, historically, there's been a lot of violations, and especially in the mental health side of things. And the other one is there's a lot of reasons to suggest that when it comes to addiction, addicts don't really get better unless it's their choice to do that. And therefore, they're going to go through this very painful withdrawal. It's a really horrible experience, physically, mentally, and then they're going to just relapse because they haven't made that choice on their own. So what are your thoughts on those two things?
Yeah, I think so. I start with Serenity Prayer. Serenity Prayer for me is, I thought it when I was a kid, I thought it was so corny, but as I've gotten older and I've become a strong believer in the importance of Stoic philosophy, which starts with, get clarity about what you can do and what you can't do. And Serenity Prayer, which has been misread as timidity, actually says, you get clear, what can you do, what can't you do, but then have the courage to do the things you can do. So I think, I don't think that we should, I don't think that I think that trying to solve addiction is super difficult. And my view is not like we're going to get rid of addiction. There's actually a lot of different addictions, or even intoxication, and there's all sorts of, but there's a space where personal health decisions impact societal needs, including for public safety. So my thing is like, look, if you're going to smoke fentanyl and meth in the privacy of your own home, I think that's a terrible idea. I think we should have public health campaigns that encourage you not to do that. See a psychiatrist. Maybe you maybe you need an antidepressant. Maybe you would rather just smoke marijuana than fentanyl, which is much better. Nobody ever dies of marijuana. Maybe you need to exercise more. Like there should be a societal interest in discouraging those behaviors. And I don't think it should be a huge priority to go hunting people down in their homes. It wouldn't be something I would recommend. I'd be against that. But if you are living in a tent, in under the highway, and you are psychotic and you're a threat to yourself or others, we've decided as a society that we're not going to allow that. Now, I think you would go up to that person like they do in Amsterdam and Netherlands and say, you can't be here. And we have a place for you that's safe and clean. And in that place, you will also be able to access services, including potentially medical care. And we have that place available for you right now. And there's no consequences if you don't go, but you can't stay here. And you can't go somewhere else where it's illegal to camp because it's not safe. It's not safe for you. It's not safe for anybody else. We don't have toilet facilities here for you. We don't have any way for you to be here. So you do that. And then if that person is like, no, I'm not going to leave, then they need to be arrested and mandated the care just for straight public safety reasons. And then the question is, what are you going to do with that person? And if you're taking them into custody, I think the humane thing to do is to know whether or not, for example, they're psychotic, evaluate them potentially, but still that would not be something like, you wouldn't be like maybe able to mandate them to a year in rehab just because they were sleeping outside. You would probably need to develop some sort of a case history with these folks. We know that mentally ill people are much more likely to go and get the care they need in France or in the Netherlands than they are in California or on the West Coast. And that is in large part because their care system is so much better than ours. So to a significant extent, this is a problem of healthcare delivery, particularly of mental health care delivery. It's not necessarily a case of universal health insurance because Canada has universal health care, and yet you still have the disaster in Vancouver. It really
Well,
comes
we
in.
don't have a good one for mental health. So I would
Yeah.
say that it's an issue because, for example, when it comes to like even seeing a psychiatrist, first of all, if you just have depression or something like that, you're not going to get to see one. But even if you have more serious mental health issues, you're going to be on a wait list for a very long time. So there's very serious limitations in that healthcare system. So I would say it is a failure of that as well. And in the US, I would say, when you don't have even like, other kinds of care, and then you don't have mental health care as well. And people probably have an even tougher time accessing that. It's very expensive. I mean, seeing a psychologist is incredibly expensive. Seeing a psychiatrist is probably even more expensive. The medications can be pretty expensive as well. So all of that combined, I don't think people have really access and I don't know what the situation is, but like, are people even able to do people sort of largely support prioritizing that over, say, just basic medical care, which people don't have? Like, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, and the situation obviously in Canada is a little different from the United States, but definitely similar in this being neglected in terms of we don't have enough psychiatrists, we don't have enough psychiatric care nurses or social workers who are capable of being case managers. Often people who maybe need to see a psychiatrist don't need to see a psychiatrist more than a few times to kind of get a diagnosis, to get a potential prescription, and then to kind of touch up the prescription and continue to monitor it. A lot of people, it's a highly diverse population. Obviously, the people that are on the street. Some people, you're just an addict. You just got addicted to opioids or meth or something, and you just probably need some recovery. Like maybe you need an antidepressant or something like that. You probably don't need an ADHD drug. Maybe you need an antidepressant. Maybe you need something else but if it's basically just addiction and you have kind of the levels of ups and downs that the worried well have, then that's a pretty easier case to deal with. And they need some kind of mandated recovery probably, and then a job, and then reintegration to family and community. People with schizophrenia are going to need lifelong care. They're probably going to need to be in some kind of group home. Group homes are really good solutions because you're with 6 to 12 other people, maybe a little bit more, not too much, hopefully. And you've got a social worker 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in case there's problems. And people can even get their own private room and maybe even their own bathroom, or they can share a bathroom with 1 or 2 other people with a common
And
area
there's
to
a
kind of
community too.
built
I
in
mean, they go
community.
on field trips, and because I
Yeah.
have a family member who in a different country who's part of this, and it's actually not a it's a good living situation if it's a good group home. So if for mental health issues in this particular case, and it's actually, I think it's a pretty good potential solution that I don't know. I'm not aware of that being the case in, say, Canada or the US. I may just not be aware. I'm not knowledgeable about it, but it's like in Canada, for example, they closed the mental health facilities. We had one called Riverview, and now it's the most shot in location for film productions. There's
Mhm.
asbestos everywhere, and it's haunted. Ghost hunters go there, but it's not functional. I think they have announced that they had some plans to do some care there, but really there's maybe a few buildings, tiny buildings, and it's actually a giant piece of land. It has really great skeleton in terms of like big windows. It's a very depressing space. Like you could see that it was like probably a terrible facility of torture in many ways. But that doesn't mean you can't rebuild it and make it really great. You have large windows and greenery everywhere. You can make it fantastic, but I guess there's not that investment in it, and you see people just ever since they closed it. I mean, you see people walking around talking to themselves, and they don't really have care. Like a group home would be great, or taking that space and giving people care, but that doesn't happen. And even in this country that people consider to be rather social welfare based, those things are ignored, and people assume that there is this level of great care and healthcare, which I personally do support, but and people attack me when I criticize it, like I want to do away with it. But no, I just want it to be better, because I don't think it's functioning very well when you have to wait months and months to see a specialist. You can't, emergency, you end up waiting for a day to see somebody. It's not functioning very well, and when it comes to mental health, it's really not functioning at all. You pretty much you see your general, your like family doctor, but most people, by the way, don't even have a family doctor because they can't access one. It's almost impossible to get one, and a family doctor is not an expert in mental health care. So they just give you a drug, and they
Right.
guess at it completely. And they have like basically a form that they give you, and they're like, well, do you check this criteria? They don't know what they're doing. So that's a major crisis. So if they can't treat people, and they don't treat them correctly, and maybe they give them drugs that they shouldn't be having, and then they mix a whole bunch of random things, like no wonder some people end up on the street, because they might have been even misdiagnosed. I've had friends living in the US who've been given lithium when that's not at all what they were meant to be, and it made them behave in ways that were not consistent with how they should be behaving. Um,
For
so
sure.
I
Yeah,
just
so the
went on a
question
little rant there.
Yeah, so then the question is why, if you look at public opinion research, like the public wants mentally ill people to be properly cared for. There's really no question that there's a strong majority. And if you look at the way people vote, and I suspect it's very similar in Canada, I can't imagine it's much different. People constantly voting for more money for these things. This is something that Congress has said, bipartisan. There's been Republican and Democratic bipartisan saying that the health insurance companies here must offer what's called parity, meaning the same high quality level of care for people suffering mental illnesses as physical illnesses. So then why are we still not getting the right care for people? So this was one of the big questions that I wanted to address in San Francisco. And the short answer is basically that it continues to be public concern and advocacy against any kind of coercive or mandated care. And that without that, then you're not actually able to require people to get the care that they need and maintain and enforce it. So then you don't have the services being built up in a way that you would need to. My aunt was fortunate because she had schizophrenia, but she never became a drug user or a prostitute. And so she was never like escaping from the group home. But I am confident that if she had tried to live on the street at the time she was there, the family could have gotten the police to get her off the streets. That's become harder to do. There's more judges, there's more laws, there's more reasons, there's more constituencies that have basically kept people on the streets. Because part of the problem is like, if someone that is like suffering, let's say from schizophrenia or even from late stage drug addiction, and somebody says to them, hey, well, you got to come off the street, and they say, I don't want to go, they now have attorneys and whole organizations that will basically go to court and say, yeah, Michael doesn't want to go to hospital. He wants to stay in a tent on the sidewalk, and he should be able to do that. I think, and most people think that's bonkers, but the small group of advocates that have managed to kind of control the issue and shape how we think about it have continued to kind of maintain ideological supremacy, as well as control over how cities spend the money and over the nonprofit service sectors, which have a financial interest in maintaining the status quo rather than getting people the help they need.
Well, I guess even people like me, where I'm sort of resistant to, like I mentioned, to some of these ideas. But then at the same time, if you were to say, hey, okay, in this country, well, like you said, the carrot and stick kind of approach. If you said, okay, in this case, we tried this experiment where we offer them dogs. I don't know, because actually this is something that there was some sort of an experiment there. We offered them dogs and apartments of their own if they sustain a drug-free life for a year, and this worked. And actually, the results were that after they got their reward, they were able to live off of the streets and those apartments for 5 years after that, clean, and continue. That's the result.
Right.
I think when I look at something like that, I might go, okay, yeah, let's try that, right? And so are there things like that you can use as examples, especially things that maybe worked in other countries? Because it sounds like you've done a lot of research on that, that are promising that we could try in North America.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the broad view. My view is that it's basically the same set of solutions everywhere. That you need carrots and sticks everywhere. They're much harsher in Japan and in Asia with people, and much stricter than they are in, for example, the Netherlands. But really, they're always getting people off the street. They're always getting people the care they need. I do think that we're different. I don't want to say we're not going to all be. We are. There's a difference between North America and Europe in terms of our libertarianism. And then there's even a difference between West Coast and East Coast. The East Coast is just that much closer to Europe. Like in Boston, they don't allow people to do the kind of things that they allow them to do out here. The progressive mayor of Boston, who's super woke, just listen to her talk, just sounds like a woke West Coast politician. She shut down the homeless encampment and moved people. They kind of use different language and but they're getting people inside. I mean, she's doing the same thing that Rudy Giuliani, would have been doing, but she's very progressive. Yeah. And even in Los Angeles now, we have a very progressive mayor that was elected, but unless she's getting people inside. And in Seattle and in Vancouver, I think we're seeing them. I don't know the status of Vancouver. I need to visit, but it appears that you're starting to get the politicians starting to do that. But like you said, that we still have, or like we've been talking about, we still have some laws in the way. We still have some culture and belief issues. We still have some judges where we still have enough discomfort on the coercive mandatory part, both for addicts and the mentally ill, that I do think it remains a barrier, and that we're going to have to get over some of that if we're going to get people the care they need. We keep passing laws. There's these laws. They're often instigated because a mentally ill person goes off their meds and kills somebody, and then the parents of that victim passes legislation that says we need to mandate the taking of your meds if you're mentally ill and deemed a threat to yourself or others, basically. These laws pass and then they can't quite get enforced. And some of it, you can kind of blame the ACLU, at least in the United States. I'm assuming you have civil rights groups in Canada that do something similar. But those groups are just very successful, and we've never had a political counterweight to them until now. With the book, we've now organized something called North America Recovers, which is trying to be more of a counterweight to the more radical, let people do whatever they want to do because they're victims approach.
Right. What do you think about some of the some critics of the policies have also kind of brought up the fact that the way that the police deal with people on the streets is that, the police have gotten a little too chummy with them, and there's like a policing policy that's different. Do you think that affects things at all?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak exactly to the police in Vancouver because I haven't been there. But if it's basically the same as Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, then the policing problem is we're in such trouble with the police right now. I mean, each of our police forces, I'm sure it's got to be similar in Vancouver. The San Francisco police are down 540 officers. That's an astonishing number of police to be below. I mean, it's amazing. Los Angeles, similar, several hundred police officers short. You see, I just saw something on Twitter. It was not even that remarkable, but a woman saying that they'd been complaining about a homeless encampment across the street from her daughter's school. Then one of the guy gets out. He's psychotic. He's waving a machete around at the entrance to this elementary school, and then they took the police 35 minutes to get there. I just published a piece, Leighton and I did. We did 2 pieces on a 14-year-old girl who was being sex trafficked in San Francisco. And the first piece, we describe how the police were called and they didn't come, even though they had the girl, they had a warrant out for her they could apprehend her, they could rescue her, and the police didn't come. Wow. We looked into it. I mean, when Leighton and I, as my colleague, when we emailed the police station and we're writing a story about this, to their credit, the assistant police chief called us back within 2 hours. We were on the phone with him, or he emailed us back, and we arranged a call that night. And he was like, "I'm a dad of a 15-year-old. We're going to get this done, and we're going to figure out what went wrong. So just because you're down police doesn't mean you can't respond." So this is, I don't mean this isn't like such a steeplechase to answer what you have as a simple question, but you get to it and you kind of go, they don't have enough officers. The officers they have are demoralized. A lot of the officers who are more, I don't want to put anybody down who's there, but all of the officers who get more frustrated at their inability to do their job have left. So you might have more police officers, I think it's fair to say, who are more relaxed about them able to do their jobs. People that are high energy, maybe a little bit on the disagreeable side, but want to do a really good job. When they're not able to do a good job, they get frustrated and quit. That's true in any profession, including policing. So yeah, you start to get a culture where, we, Leighton gets maybe even more frustrated than I do. We both get frustrated, but I tend never to get super mad at cops because I definitely think that they've been blamed for things that they didn't do. But definitely, there's moments where you see the police, right there watching a drug deal go down, watching a woman being sex trafficked, and you can't help but be like, dude, why aren't you doing anything? And so, the real problem is, of course, the police officer would tell you, he or she would say, if I arrest this person, they're going to go in front of a judge. The judge isn't going to do anything. Or if they do, they'll be back on the streets. Why am I doing this? The prosecutor's not going to prosecute. They don't even have the right laws to prosecute. and the judges, say they don't want to crack down on this, and ultimately it reflects to some extent the voters themselves who keep saying, I think part of it's changing now, but there's been this idea that there's victimless crimes. The fact of the matter is, if it's a crime, there's basically always a victim. That like, and especially when you look at it, you go, victimless crime, like prostitution, a woman or a man freely sells his or her body for, a few minutes or hours or whatever, and they're freely entering this exchange. Well, you look at it and you find a lot of, psychiatrically distressed people, traumatized people that have been drugged and are emotionally manipulated into sex trafficking. Doesn't start to seem super, like a victimless crime, or even the drugs. So I think there's been a lot of, like, I think progressives in particular, we looked at these issues and we were like, look, at best, this is just vice, crimes. At worst, these are ways to criminalize poor Black and brown people. And we don't want to do that. And I think when you kind of pull back, you go, these things are like vice crimes are often important to remain prohibited because they become moments to get true victims the care that they need. Like this 14-year-old girl, by definition, as a minor, she cannot consent to engage in sex work. But even people that are older or that are addicted or whatever, it raises real questions of free will and consent. Addicts will tell you that they've lost control of what they're able to do because of their addictions. And so it starts to raise, when we started talking about protecting freedoms, you have to ask, are you protecting the freedom or are you protecting the mental illness?
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, you can make that argument that that person isn't really able to make choices at that point because they're not really in a place where they have free will, because the drug really has their has their free will.
Yeah.
They have the control over them, and in that position, uh, the drug, you can step in, because we do when somebody has, say, mental illness and they're a vulnerable person. So we've already made those decisions. And so in that way we can arrive. I mean, if anything in this conversation, it reveals that there isn't like a perfect, idealistic, morally 100% position that I can be, comfortable with. And to some extent, there is some compromise that has to be made. And so ultimately, I have to ask myself, there is an end result that what is going to suit, what's going to serve. I guess I would have to look at the better, greater good of that person. I hate to use the word greater good. I wish I've avoided it just now, but what would serve the person more, at the end? And
You don't even
perhaps,
have to be, that paternalistic in the sense that,
yeah,
like, like I said, it's kind of like, because first of all, absolutely. I mean, like, psychiatric power can be absolutely abused, and it was abused without a doubt. And people that, men who wanted to get rid of their wives, famously sent their wives into psychiatric hospitals. It's a horrible thing, and it should never be allowed to happen.
yeah,
We're so far from that at this point. We're so far from that we won't even send people with schizophrenia and methamphetamine habits that are living in their own waste, and including bodily waste and risking infection. We won't even send them, won't even mandate care for them at this point. So you can kind of go, there's a lot of gray area, but we've just like gone so far in one direction. We were really far in one direction at one point. We've now gone super far in the other direction. If you go to Amsterdam or Lisbon or any other developed country, and you go to their psychiatric hospitals, I guarantee that they are more humane, and you would view them as more humane and more compassionate than what we do here, either in our jails or prisons or in the encampments where many of those people live. I promise you'll find them more compassionate and humane. So there is, and the streets have basically close to no homeless people. I saw a few in Portugal. I saw one in Amsterdam. There are some more, but sometimes they're refugees too. It's hard to tell, but nothing like here or in Vancouver. And So on the one hand, yeah, there's definitely some amount of compromising, like it's never going to be perfect. But I do think what I get inspired by from Western Europe is that it can be a heck of a lot better than it is here, both on the streets and for the people that are affected by the addiction and the mental illness.
Yeah, well, I think, you know, the policies that so far haven't been working out so well. In fact, things have been getting worse, so maybe it is time to try something different. And maybe that is a bit of a, I mean, it seems like things have been working better in Europe, like you say. So I am a fan of looking at what other countries are doing and seeing what we can take. They're not the same. We don't have the same culture, like you said. We don't have the same population size,
Right.
but some things we can definitely try and adapt.
Yeah.
Um, my question is going to be this: what's your biggest lesson, and as you started working on this issue, and where, you know, has there been a change where you started and where you are now?
I mean, right now I'm really excited. So I mean, one of the things that I was not able to do while working on San Francisco was to think about how it was related to Apocalypse Never. And I've done more on those connecting, particularly through wokeism, the ways in which victimhood ideology is driving a bunch of the stuff on homelessness. And I think a more apocalyptic, and you know, it used to be more utopian, but a more apocalyptic element of that woke religion is in the energy and environment space. And now we're looking more at issues of race and trans, the more kind of central categories in wokeism. And we're starting to think a lot about what a kind of normie agenda would look like, one that would potentially unite both anti-woke liberals and conservatives. So we just circulated a letter defending Jordan Peterson, and the letter, you know, and we're writing a kind of article to context it and to say some of the things that it's shocking that must be said, but must be said, which is one can defend, you know, someone like Jordan Peterson, and I agree with him on a bunch of issues. I don't agree with him on everything, and one would not need to agree with him on anything to not think he should have his license revoked for his
Yeah,
political statements. And so I do
exactly.
think that we're, this a very good writer at Compact, which is one of my favorite magazines right now. I'll butcher his name. I think it's Musa Algari, has written a piece that basically argues that wokeism has peaked, and I agree with him, and also think that wokeism is the more powerful than ever, and that it'll probably plateau for a while before its power goes down. But I feel like there's a bunch of interesting intellectual work that is needed right now, and political work that would consist of trying to figure out what happened over the last several years. Like, why did everybody go so crazy? Why does it seem like cluster B personality disorders are more common in the population? Why does it seem like people were engaged in so much narcissism, psychopathy, borderline, and histrionic behavior over the last several years? How do we talk about those things without it feeling like we're just using them as pejoratives? You know, what is a more positive agenda on the things that we all care about, that I think the anti-woke movement writ large cares about? And what are the things where that might divide liberal and conservative anti-woke folks that we should be aware of? I mean, I think there's a number of us who came out of the left that hold on to some of our earlier beliefs around things like abortion, guns, probably marijuana, same-sex marriage, that conservatives would have very different views on, but we might share similar views on things like, you know, freedom of speech, protecting kids from, making sure that kids are getting the right treatment for their gender dysphoria, and not
Hmm.
necessarily assume it's going to be puberty blockers and surgeries in every case. Um, so I think things like that are very interesting. And so we're just really excited right now to be kind of journalists and investigating things like sex trafficking and the drug trade, but also kind of being a community of, you know, what might have been called the IDW a few years ago. Maybe we'd call it a coalition of the normies that is capable. You like that? Coalition of the
I like
normies?
that. Yeah,
Kind
yeah,
of,
I love
yeah,
it.
because it's not pretentious either, and it's sort of trying to be something for ordinary folks, which is just kind of pretty. I think most people don't have super utopian demands. They just want, safe cities. They want good schools for their kids. They want cheap energy and water, and food for themselves. They don't have to spend a lot of money. They want to be able to take a vacation, once or twice a year. And I think we got ourselves people got a little extreme. And I think that social media created a lot of anxiety, and we're pulling back from that and kind of figuring out how to manage the social media ecosystem and the craziness. And so I'm actually pretty optimistic long term, and I think we're entering what could potentially be a golden age, both for journalism and also for a kind of new moderate politics.
Oh, well, I'm excited to hear anything that's more positive, because anything that says gold age, and golden age, I love the name, the Coalition of the Normies. I will ask you one Twitter Files question, which is,
Sure.
obviously you've been part of a team that's been working on that, and yeah, I'm curious to know if you had any preconceived notions before you started investigating, and then if anything kind of surprised you along the way.
Mm. That's a very interesting question. I was not sure at all what we were going to find. I had no idea what it was. And by the way, I was invited by my friend Barry Weiss, not by Elon. I did not know Elon did not know who I was before the Twitter Files. At least that's what he said. So yeah, what was the most interesting thing? I think for me, it's still around some very troubling and interesting and weird behavior by the FBI and intelligence agencies, particularly as it related to Hunter Biden's laptop. I had always felt like the Russian disinformation threat was being hyped, in part because of 2016, but I really saw up close how threat inflation of Russian disinfo was being used to demand censorship in a lot of different ways, and also to sort of manipulate journalists and Twitter people to dismiss the laptop, but also to do a bunch of other things. And I think it's funny. I think it made me a little bit more libertarian. I've always said that I've got parts of me that are libertarian and conservative. Liberal in my concern for the vulnerable, libertarian in my love of freedom, conservative in that I think you need civilization. But I think the libertarian part was like, what is the reason for all this FBI involvement in these media companies? It was not good or justified. I'm not saying that you should never have it. I don't want to go to some other extreme, but I think it made me realize why libertarians are so focused on keeping law enforcement out of areas of freedom of speech and being super cautious there, because it's creepy. And it actually, just having law enforcement involved chills your freedom of speech. And I think one of the most interesting parts of it is, does it affect how people behave if the FBI is listening, or if that you might be cast as a foreigner? There's psychologically, there's this in-group, out-group thing that gets created where we'd start to see it abused. People would say things like, you get these people would be like, oh, well, this isn't necessarily a Russian account, but it appears to be Russian influenced. Well, that's McCarthyism. That starts to become a kind of, associate guilt by association, maybe you are influenced by Russia, and maybe that's okay. In other words, you wouldn't be necessarily like everything Russians. Is a little bit like who else like German shepherds, Adolf Hitler, it's got a bit of that quality to it. And I think that had a really chilling impact, and one that we haven't fully dealt with as a society.
Yeah. And I think it's something where people are just, there's a legal distinction, right? Like, if the FBI doesn't say, well, you can't say that, or if you say that, we'll put you in prison, or if you don't remove that, we'll put you in prison. That's a legal violation. But just because, or the White House, just because they say something, though, they're like, well, it'd be nice if you said it this way.
Right.
To me, that inherent pressure is just as bad. but is it illegal? I don't know. I think
Right.
that will have to be sort of discussed. And maybe if it's not illegal, like maybe there needs to be rules placed, to
Yes.
make it so. But that already is just so, let's say, problematic
Yes.
in terms of freedom of speech and the chill factor, like you said, McCarthyism. And what you're saying, like with Russia, like I'm staunchly like I'm pretty pro-Ukrainian, but there was a time there was censorship where and there's a lot of people who say, well, you should censor anything that's pro-Russia. Well, I disagree with that because various reasons. But as soon as you start censoring anything, it's not because I support Russia in any way. But once you start censoring anything, you can censor anything. Or once you start censoring something, you can censor anything. And so I see that as a fundamentally huge problem. But a lot of people don't. And that to me is a little bit terrifying,
Or
actually.
think there should be more censorship.
Yeah, there's a lot of people think there should be censorship, more censorship. But I also see the conservatives and as much as they've sort of taken the stance of like, okay, we're pro free speech, I also see a not an insignificant group of them saying, yeah, free speech, but in these situations. So everyone makes like exceptions for censorship. And so unless you're fundamentally willing to stand up for it, for free speech everywhere, no matter who says it, no matter what it is, everyone's going to find exceptions at some point. And
Yeah.
that's why, I think it's so fundamentally important.
I think I
And
was
that's why.
less. I think I was less. I really think it's a slippery slope now. Like I really think the slope is very, very slippery, and because I've seen the slippage, and so I would say I'm not a free speech absolutist. I don't think it's possible, but I
Mhm.
want to be as close to free speech absolutism as possible. I think the right solution to misinformation and disinformation is more information, not more censorship in general. But I also support the uncontroversial, let's face it, uncontroversial existing Supreme Court doctrines that say you cannot, use your speech to whip up a mob to go hurt people. Like we've
I
decided
agree.
that we don't allow that. You can't do that. But and it's not always a bright line, but it's pretty bright. And what we see is people abusing that and saying, I saw AOC Ocasio-Cortez in Congress on Wednesday abuse it. She was implying that libs of TikTok had resulted in a bomb threat against Children's Hospital. No, it's just not. And you have to be careful when you're doing that because that is the basis of censorship. And so you start abusing that. I think that the whole society has to be like, wait a second, you're not someone tweeting a criticism of an institution is not the same thing as inciting violence against that institution. And you better not make that mistake.
No, I don't think you can. Certainly not inciting violence. I don't support that at all. I also don't support, though, even if somebody knowingly says something that's wrong, it's hard to prove. But if somebody lies to damage somebody's reputation or to spread a lie, I also don't believe that that's freedom of speech. Like that's an abuse. It's just very difficult to prove, but there should be a measure of proof on that. But if it's somebody's opinion, I think that's a different situation. Now you can moderate certain things. When it comes to say Twitter, I'm not even fully opposed to having moderation as opposed to 100% free speech. I do think it's better with free speech. I kind of like community notes and things like that. I think that's a better way to go. Because that way you have it's still out there, but you have context and you can choose to follow that context or not. So you're not really censoring anyone. That context may be terrible, it may be good, it may be useful, but it's there. But the content isn't being suppressed. I think that's the better way to do it myself. But I do think there could be guidelines that are just very clear and very specific, and ideally as objective as possible. But we live in at a time where there's just vast disagreement over this, and I don't know where we're going to ultimately land, but at least we're having a conversation about it, I guess.
Amen.
Well, Yeah. Well, on that note, I really appreciate your time, and I thank you so much for having this conversation with me.
Thank you, Catherine. It was wonderful talking with you.